Okay, good morning, everyone. Good Monday morning. Right after graduation, people will still be coming in, so we're looking forward to that. My name is Jennifer Cook. I'm at George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. Really happy to be hosting today's event. We're aiming to explore, to some extent, the political, social, financial, security, and cultural strategies that great powers are using within Africa. I have to say, really beginning about 20 years ago, a lot of talk here focused on China's role in Africa. What does China want? Is this good or bad for Africa? It evolved over time. Turkey became much more engaged, Russia more recently, and it's all been about what does Russia want? What is Russia doing? Is this good or bad for Africa? And here in Washington circles, it's been about, okay, what should Washington do to stay relevant and influential to counter these so-called, and I put this in quotes, malign influences in Africa? What's been missing to a large extent in Washington circles, and to some extent, I think until recently in African circles even, is what are African strategies towards these great powers? People talk about a Cold War redux these days, but the fact is Africa is different, the world is different, and African governments, African citizens have choices and can also shape the engagement to their advantage. So today we have just a really fantastic group of speakers whom I'll introduce in just a moment. But I think what we want to talk about a little bit, in addition to, okay, what are the objectives? What is this big picture? Where is this all leading? This kind of global tectonic shift of alliances, which I don't think we're quite sure where this is going to end up, this new global alignment of forces, and in a much more multipolar world. But we want to talk also about kind of what are the various African strategies towards these great powers. And Africa obviously is not a monolith, so there's variety in the responses. Are African governments and citizens taking advantage of the opportunities? Are they minimizing the downsides? Is engagement pragmatic or more ideological? Is it kind of an uncritical embrace of somebody who's a nice break from some of the traditional actors in Africa, or is it selective engagement? And I think even in the countries represented here, we have a good range of responses. Just to say, South Africa has been very much in the news these past weeks. Our former dean here at the Elliott School, Ruben Brigadine, now the U.S. ambassador to South Africa, made quite a stir when he publicly accused the South African government of shipping arms to Russia, saying that he would bet his life on it. There were not exactly denials from the South African government, but it certainly caused a major stir, and I think major questions within South Africa about what their strategy is in this moment. And I have more to say on South Africa, but I think we'll stay for the discussion. And then you have other countries, and I would say that Kenya is one of them, where there's kind of a much more strategic approach to some of this great power competition. So I'm going to, we have quite a few speakers, so we're going to try to keep it lively and moving. I've asked speakers to keep their responses fairly short, but we can come back and you should feel free to raise two fingers or raise your hand if you want to come back to a point or expand on a point that somebody has made. And so we'll start with maybe 2 rounds of kind of formal questions for your opening interventions, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So let me introduce our speakers. A late addition, and we're really delighted, is Lee Kinyanjui, who served as governor of Nakuru County in Kenya until August 2022. Kinyanjui was served previously as the Assistant Minister for Roads and later as the chairperson of the National Transport and Safety Authority. from which he resigned in order to run for governor. And obviously, China is very much engaged in the transport sector, so very much looking forward to hearing your interventions on that and more. Also joining us, we have Sanusha Naidu, who's a senior research fellow at the Institute for Global Dialogue in South Africa. Her research interests include democratization in Africa, Africa's political economy and development, Africa's relations with emerging powers from the South, so BRICS and IBSA, and South African foreign policy analysis. We do have your bio here, so I'm not giving you short shrift. I'm delighted to have you here and looking forward to your thoughts on kind of the situation in South Africa, among other things. Next, we have Paul Nantulia, who's a research associate at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies in the U.S. Department of Defense, part of the National Defense University, where he does analysis on contemporary African security issues. His area of expertise includes Chinese foreign policy, China-Africa relations, quite a good deal on the China's security engagement in Africa, which is kind of has been less studied. And so I was just saying I assigned quite a bit of his work in my classes. So thank you, Paul, for joining us. We have, I believe, he has not yet joined us, and I will check that he's not waiting among the participants, and I will change him to a panelist if he is. Adriano Nuvunga, who is a scholar and leading civil society activist in Mozambique. He's director of the Center for Democracy and Development, a civil society organization working on youth leadership, democracy, and development policy towards the nurturing of transformational leadership for development change in Mozambique. Really looking forward to hearing Mozambican perspective. It's not one that we often or adequately get here in Washington. And we have James Shikwati, who is founder and director of the Interregion Economic Network, a think tank developing ideas and strategies to enhance quality of life for people in Africa. He's founder and CEO of the online business opinion magazine, The African Executive, and country director of Enactus Kenya, a program present in 33 Kenyan public and private universities. You are all welcome to say a bit more about your backgrounds if I've missed something that's kind of critical to this discussion, but you all have very long bios. And then finally, we have Gilbert Kariagala, who is director of the African Center for the Study of the United States at University of Witwatersrand, so one of the major partners in this endeavor. Gilbert is, he has a wide range of expertise. I actually don't have his bio here, but done a lot on African foreign policy, African security issues, African regional cooperation. So Gilbert, thank you very much for being here. And we'll be joined by Bob Wakesa, who is here in Washington for a year with the Annenberg Center, but is Gilbert's colleague at University of Witwatersrand. So after that very long series of introductions, Adam, would you like to say a few words, or should we get into the convo?
Excuse me, I'll be very brief. I think that what we're seeing also reported occasionally here in the United States is the role of African countries in trying to broker a peace in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And 6 countries, I believe, have now partnered in that effort. And so that'll be an interesting element of what we can discuss today. Also, the role of the Gulf states in Africa, particularly East Africa, is of interest. But for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, one of the differentiating features of this partnership and of these forums is that we want to feature African voices and African points of view about Africa. So without further ado, I should step back and make room for African voices.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, why don't we begin I think I'd love for us to kind of get the big picture on the table first, and perhaps talk about, how do from an African perspective or your perspective, there's no single African perspective, what does this moment mean in terms of kind of these great power engagement, these tectonic shifts within the global order? And then perhaps a little bit on how you see the different strategies of these great powers within Africa. I know you don't need to speak to each one. I know some of you have focused more on some than others, but maybe kind of your initial thoughts on the big picture of this moment in geopolitical engagement. I think I will, if you don't mind, go in the order in which I introduced you, if that's okay. That means, Governor, you are going to be up first. So we'll start with you. Again, we're thinking 5 minutes to get started, and then we will definitely come back to you.
Thank you very much. And once again, I wish to pass my gratitude for the opportunity for this interaction. As has been said about me, I serve in the national government and also in the sub-national government in Kenya. And maybe my perspectives are also largely influenced by that. I'm happy also to participate among the African voices to try and look where we are and possibly what are the key factors that inform where we are. And therefore, to that effect, allow me first to say what is of greatest interest to African countries at this particular point in time. And I think it's also important to note that Africa is not a country, and therefore every country has its own transcript, its own unique circumstances. Therefore, maybe generalities may not quite be the same in every country, but the reality is that there are some overriding factors that cut across, and I think that is where we also want to focus. I think the first one we want to say is that we have a major challenge of the youth. Young people who are getting out of the colleges and the universities, who are being churned out to our cities, and the number of jobs that are being created are not enough. One of the consequences of starts is probably what we see across the Mediterranean and many other countries, and creating huge immigration problems across the world, not just in Africa. And therefore, to that extent, as Africa looks to the rest of the world, this is one of the key issues that definitely will be on the table in determining who we work with. Secondly, is the issue of COVID and the post-COVID impact on our economies. I think the full economic impact of COVID on African economies is yet to be accounted. And I'm saying this because the disruptions that came during that particular period and how it impacted national governments and also sub-national governments also left a very huge financial burden that now coupled with later on when we have the war in Ukraine has complicated the situation. And needless to say that this is also closely connected to, again, the debt issue, because when we have huge deficits, there must be a way of us trying to find and deal with this particular problem. So as a result of that, some of them, including our country, Kenya, have serious challenges on servicing their debts. And in an attempt to try and ensure that you do not default, one of the things that is happening is that other critical services, including health, water, and security, have definitely been compromised. Therefore, again, as Africa and Kenya and everybody else looks into the world, how can we be able to address this issue? Because as we all know, every country looks at national interests, and this is really a critical issue on how we address the issue of the debt crisis in Africa. And also closely mentioned around the debt problem is the fact that in recent years, China has emerged as a key lender to Africa, and maybe the terms of some of the loans that have been given may not necessarily be public, and maybe even the agreement signs are not very easy to disclose. Therefore, restructuring becomes difficult within the broader multilateral context. It's also good to note that why Chinese loans also became very acceptable is because they were fast. They had no huge attachment of conditions before they could be attained. And therefore, many countries within Africa have found themselves in this particular trap. The other issue that is also of great importance is the issue of minerals. We know that much of Africa is largely unexplored. We have key areas like South Africa, parts of West Africa, but the reality is that only about 30% of the minerals beneath have been explored. And therefore, Africa is looking at partners or partnerships that can help us to explore this part of the world. And indeed, this is also closely connected to the previous challenge, because if we can be able to exploit our mineral potential, then maybe even the issue of debt can also be equally leveraged. Worth noting is that wherever there are huge minerals, we have also found great challenges with respect to security and stability. And I think the first place you can all think of is the DRC, the Eastern DRC, where we have huge mineral deposits of cobalt, among others, that are very critical in the green energy and all these other things that have come up in recent days. And therefore, being a very important and critical mineral, because of weak governments and sometimes governments not being present in every corner of the country, then we have issues of instability. And therefore, moving forward, Africa will also be looking at partners who will be able to help her exploit her mineral potential and also leverage on that. Worth noting is the fact that minerals are often mined and taken for value addition, and therefore in terms of benefiting the local people and also the wealth and how communities can be managed, I think this will also be a very critical issue that we will want to look at as we move forward. Allow me also to mention that in recent days, we have seen a shift in international sort of dynamics in respect to Africa, that if you look at maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was a lot of attachment to democracy, especially with the big powers, the Western powers. But I think as time has gone, it is more of an interest-based and less mention of democracy moving forward. So, but I think it's also important to say that there's no way we can be able to develop without looking at the issue of democracy and good governance. Because if these countries are to invest in Africa, if you're to put your resources in Africa, then you want to be sure that there's stability and that even in coming years, we are not likely to have challenges in that area. Lastly, I know we are pressed for time, is also to mention that with respect to debt, there are issues emerging around the possibility of countries being unable to service their debt requirements. And I think this has been a rumor, but I think with every passing day, it is becoming a reality. Ghana already has declared that they could not be able to continue servicing the debts. In my own country, we have serious challenges. Only last month, we had delayed payment of salaries to civil servants. And I'm sure as we move forward, other critical services, including health, road, and water, will also be equally affected. And therefore, as we move forward, I think the bigger question will be how can this debt issue be managed and how can countries, especially the Western nations, come together? Now, one challenge that has been there historically is that Africa has many countries, but when you want to imagine the size of each country now negotiating, for example, with the USA, say Rwanda, say Mali, say Kenya, or any other country, then you are looking at a meeting of not exactly equals. Therefore, there's need for us to leverage, have economic blocks, and also look at cross-cutting issues so that our agenda can be heard and also felt. We also see that there is a very urgent need to ensure that Africa is also in the forefront and that we are not just looking at waiting for the next meeting convened by Russia, the next meeting convened by China, the other one convened by another country, and therefore you are not also in the forefront in coming up with solutions that will help you to address. And maybe one of the things that we have also learned, especially after the COVID pandemic, is that the world is very interconnected, that some of the areas we ignore will finally come to haunt us. Therefore, we all have a responsibility to ensure that we work together, and that the challenges that are in Africa are also challenges for the rest of the world, and that we should be able to have a clear policy that generates a win-win situation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Perfect, perfect beginning to the session. I'm going to turn to Sanusha next. Welcome from South Africa.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for the invitation to Bob. And it's good to be on the panel with such an esteemed set of colleagues and experts. I'll try to limit what I say because I think the governor has picked up on a very important set of points in terms of the big picture construct and characterization. I think the starting point for me is really the international system, the order itself. And recently, our ambassador Anil Suklal, who also serves on the BRICS as the Sherpa, made a very interesting statement in an interview with one of our daily newspapers, and he was asked to try and characterize the international system and where we find ourselves in, both as South Africa, but I think he was speaking more broadly. And he said, we are in a world in between orders. We are neither in a unipolar world nor a bipolar world. We haven't reached multipolarity yet. This is the gray area that we find ourselves in at this moment in time. And I think that in itself captures, for me, the kind of big picture for Africa. We talk a lot about Africa and the fact that Africa is not homogeneous. Africa is very fragmented in terms of economies of scale, in terms of size of countries, in terms of population dynamics, in terms of the relationship African countries have with the respective partners on the outside. But I think we're sitting in a very important historical moment when it comes to the international order. It's deepening in terms of its geopolitical context and the complexities that underpin it, but it's also becoming more divisive in terms of how do you, as a continent or as an actor, whether we talk about Africa or we talk about individual countries or we talk about Asian countries, is how do you structure your partnership with the various actors that were mentioned in Bob's concept document. And I think, as we were rightly also pointed out to, in terms of the actors that have come following China and India, as well as the resurgence of Russia, the Gulf states, the relationship between Qatar and the many other areas in the East African region. And I think that in itself tells us that we're sitting in a system where we have to think about what type of partnerships we're thinking about. So there's the one section of whether we're talking about an engagement with big powers and emerging powers or great powers, however we want to define the labeling, and what it is that we want in this partnership, both for the African continent in terms of the broad dynamics under the issues around peace and security, questions of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, but also in terms of the reforming and the strengthening of the multilateral and the global governance architecture. And there are 2 or 3 points I think that are critical to this. And there was questions being raised. Recently, I attended the BRICS Academic Forum, and questions were being raised about what does multilateral reform mean in the context of global governance institutions? And most importantly, what does it mean for Africa in terms of, is it enough to get a seat at the table, or is it more than being able to just have a seat at the table, but to able to change certain of the institutional mechanisms and devices that allow for this kind of equal access, equal opportunity, but also a partnership that leverages agency and discussion in terms of having more kind of engagement on key issues that are critical to Africa. I want to bring out 2, Madam Chair, particularly because I know we have limited time. The one is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It cannot exist in its entirety as it currently is. There are two dimensions here. From the inside, we have to think about what is the adjustment for countries to start underlining and instrumentalizing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement in terms of trade in services, trade in goods, and free movement of people. The second point linked to this, and that is a serious question for African countries to think about in the way they want to trade with each other, to increase, to boost, and basically deepen inter-African trade, because it's very low at this point. But linked to this is the outsider context of where the global economy is right now. And the global economy right now is really around this question that trade is no longer just trade. Trade is also about global value chains that are based on friend shoring, a term that has become quite interesting in the political economy discussion about where do we actually start now looking at our dynamics of trade, both within the continent, but also outside of the continent in terms of the interconnectivity that we have with the global economy. And if we look at the G7 summit this weekend, and we looked at some of the language that has come out from the G7 summit around economic cohesion, around questions of not decoupling, but basically lessening the debates, challenges about this question around de-dollarization and the issues around whether or not the BRICS represents an alternative to the global economy, etc. There's a lot that is happening in terms of narrative, in terms of the way in which trade has become much more than just about markets. It is about how do we actually push certain value chains outside of where our traditional areas of engagement were, and how do we utilize these kind of geopolitical context that we find ourselves in now, which is much more complex, much more conflictual, and much more competitive and divisive in terms of how do we do trade. So the big picture right now for us from looking from the inside out in the African context is, how do we actually define this national interest for countries in the continent? But what is going to be the role of the African Union and the Secretariat in Ghana in basically building up what strategies, not one strategy, but what strategies we develop with each of these actors and partners that are basically part of our landscape. The last point I want to make, and I think it is very important for us to make this, and that is whether or not we, within the context of Africa, and most importantly, within the context with partners, understand what is Africa's interests in the global economy and within the global context right now. It cannot be that the interest for Africa has to be, we have to make the kinds of decisions that appease and placate partners. And I think that in itself, and that goes for every actor, whether we're talking about traditional actors with external partners with Africa, as well as with emerging partners with Africa. The problem is you cannot develop one particular strategy. And I think this is where we have to start thinking about what are our sectorial interests when it comes to trade, because you cannot have trade if we don't have a set of regional economic projects that essentially define how we increase cross-border trade. Last final point, I know I said the one was before final, but final point, and that is climate change. We cannot ignore the impact of climate change on our production spheres, on our outputs, because it's also becoming increasingly a political tool in the relationship between powers outside of the continent and with the continent. And we know this in the context of the carbon border tax with the EU. We know this, that it's going to be a key issue for Africa, as well as other key actors around the world with China, etc., as well as with the US. And definitely under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, in terms of how do we look at the just energy transition within this context, and how do we define this in our relationship with external partners? Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Sanusha. Excellent. Let's go to Paul Nantulia from ACSS.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Like Sanusha, I will just say that it's really an honor to again join colleagues that I've worked with for quite a bit of time on the panel as well, and always happy to discuss discuss matters concerning Africa and external powers. So I'll just begin my remarks by saying that Africans like to be courted. They love to be courted. From the days of the Cold War and even earlier, Africans love to be courted. But Africans dislike to be trampled over and to be scrambled over. So I think these are the two frameworks that I use to look at Africa's engagement with global powers in this emerging situation of strategic competition or strategic rivalry. Africans are apprehensive, but at the same time see opportunities in these relationships. Let me begin with the apprehensive side of things. I think on the continent is we see a discourse that has emerged, and which is really not surprising, that Africans do not like to be viewed as subjects of international power politics. This really harkens back to the days of the Cold War, and when the Cold War was coming to a close, Africa felt marginalized by all the major powers. And this is one of the reasons why Japan, for instance, became very popular when it established the Tokyo International Conference on African Development, because it was an initiative that persuaded Africans that here was a power that was willing to work with African countries to champion African issues on the global stage in order to put an end to that sense of marginalization that African countries felt at the end of the Cold War. Then, of course, you then had the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, and a lot of the narratives that came out from Beijing at that time were making precisely this point, that Africa needed to have external powers that would be willing to sort of give Africa some steps, or at least a ladder, to make Africa and African issues more relevant on the global stage. So I think there's that apprehension, right? That international power rivalries could lead to a situation where the continent is marginalized, where continental issues are really not championed and really take second place to international security and economic interests and interests that are tied to global rivalries. And this is something that Africans really deeply detest, whether they're in government or whether they're in civil society, academia, and other segments of society. The other element, with regard, I'm still on the apprehensive part of the picture, is these global rivalries tend to undermine or ignore African agency. And I think this is something that has really come out, especially in this context of US-China competition, which on the continent is seen as rivalry. There's a sense that African agency, issues that are important to African communities, right? The young demographic, the demand for democracy, which right now is at least 75%, according to the latest Afrobarometer findings. The demand for startups, the demand for jobs, and so on, right? That these issues, like the points that the governor was making earlier, tend to be secondary in these rivalries. So the point of agency becomes extremely important. Now, let me quickly move to the opportunities that African stakeholders tend to see. The first is, and we can see this very clearly in a number of initiatives, right? So there are quite a few policy areas that have been largely neglected by international partners. If we go back to the Lagos Plan of Action and we come all the way up to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, there are a number of areas. One of those is infrastructure and energy, right? These are elements that stimulate economic growth. Infrastructure just basically fell by the wayside in terms of international in terms of international engagement until China came in, right? Even before the Belt and Road Initiative, everybody talks about the Belt and Road Initiative, but decades before the Belt and Road Initiative, China came in with a very, very attractive proposal on infrastructure and persuaded many African countries and African regional organizations, that these meaningful partnerships could be developed in terms of building infrastructure. Africa's infrastructure deficit at the moment stands at about 100 billion a year. This according to the Africa Development Bank, right? So what the Chinese put on the table was really seen on the African side as an effort to try and close that infrastructure gap. So when the United States came in and the G7 came in with their infrastructure packages, the European Union, these recent infrastructure packages that these other countries have come up with, Japan and the United States have framed those infrastructure packages as a counter to China's Belt and Road infrastructure plan. But on the African continent, these are not really discussed as counters. They're discussed as complementary to what the Chinese have been doing, and perhaps even triggered by the fact that the Chinese had made had covered a lot of ground in this particular area. And when one talks to diplomats and so on the African continent, one gets to, one hears this narrative that we are slowly inching towards beginning to close that 100 billion infrastructure gap. No one country can successfully close that gap. So the more actors, the better for Africa. Of course, there are issues around debt sustainability, transparency that the governor was talking about and which Sanusha also talked about, which have to be part of the equation. But nevertheless, at the macro level, these big muscle movements between these major powers are really seen as an opportunity because they provide, they give Africa more options, more strategic options at the international level. The second one is in human resource capacity building, professionalization programs, and so on. Hugely popular. I would argue that part of the popularity of the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation Forum for China-Africa Cooperation has been in the sheer number of training quotas, scholarships, fellowships that have been provided. These are very popular because education and improvement of skills is a big thing in any African country, education, scholarship, and so on. These are very, very popular. And China, certainly before COVID, FOCAC had overtaken all the other industrialized countries to train and educate and prepare the largest number of Africans, than any other industrialized country. That was before COVID. Now, interestingly, in the recent visit to Africa by Fumio Kishida, the Japanese Prime Minister, Japan pledged to train over the next 3 years 300,000 Africans. Now, that has overtaken FOCAC, not unless FOCAC of next year tries to up that number, right? And when you talk to African stakeholders, the view is Japan moved in because China was seen to have gained tremendous leverage in this particular sector, and that includes visas, right? So when you look at the visa rejection rates, for instance, of the United States and Europe, and you look at the visa rejection rates of, for instance, China, right? I mean, it's a huge gulf, right? And then it does not be, and that is one of the areas that the Chinese government has been able to leverage in terms of increasing the numbers of Africans that it trains and making China an attractive destination. And we can talk quality, we can talk about all these other elements, But nevertheless, just those numbers are significant. So that's another area that Africans really feel they can leverage, because now suddenly you now have many actors that are now coming in to provide packages in an area that had been neglected, and which the Chinese government had shown tremendous interest and gained tremendous traction. The final point that I would make is increasing African partnership and African relevance on the international stage. This has always been an emotional issue, an emotive issue for African stakeholders. Now, if we see what has happened just in the last 12 months, the Chinese have come in and said that they will support Africa's permanent membership into the G20. The Americans have come in and have said exactly the same thing. President Biden was very, very, very forceful in making that commitment a critical element of U.S.-Africa policy. The recent visit to Africa by the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz made the same commitment. The Europeans have made the same commitment. The G7 meeting, right, made a similar commitment. Now suddenly you have all these parties that might be competing against one another, or might be in a state of rivalry. But when it comes to Africa, suddenly the strategic options have been broadened, and Africa is now beginning to push an element, an item of foreign policy that has really been part of African advocacy for decades. Suddenly, it is, now Africa is now, beginning to realize that. So I would say on the infrastructure side, on human resources side, and also on increasing Africa's relevance on the international stage, opportunities are being looked at. And some African countries are trying to leverage that. Now, of course, there's a negative element, and agency can also be exercised in negative ways, right? Countries can, decide to position themselves to be sort of gravitating towards China or gravitating towards Russia in order to increase, in order to generate attention from Western countries. That's, I guess, it's a negative element of agency, but nevertheless, African countries, I mean, it's in the DNA of African governments to play one side against the other. We saw this during the Cold War as well. So I think I'll stop there and say more during the question and answer session.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. Let's turn to James Shikwa.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and greetings from Nairobi, Kenya. I'm going to make my remarks based on what I'll refer to as a foundational argument, because there's now a growing consensus when you talk about power and powers, what do we mean by that? And it's becoming increasingly clear that when you talk about powers, there's what you call the West. And when you refer to the West, you're looking at a 500-year power system that Africa has been engaging with. And we've got lots of arguments of its positives and negatives. And then there's the powers, what you'll refer to, probably powers that were playing minimal role during those 500 years, but now they are re-emerging to play a significant role in Africa. So with that background, there are these three main points I'd like to share for this conversation. So for the existing powers, they're mostly seen as the West. And the West is seen to be more missionary oriented, meaning they invest more in what I would liken as software, trying to push their value system into Africa and make Africa almost look similar to their interest. And by so doing, you'll notice that the Western powers have sort of been practicing what I call a constraining model that makes it difficult for Africa to attain its developmental goals. That is, if we buy that argument that the West has been with Africa as a power collectively for the last 500 years. And now we go to the emerging powers, which I think somehow agrees with what Paul has been raising. The emerging powers are viewed to be mostly focused on what I call the hardware, whereas the West are on the software, democracy, human rights. This is how you should behave for you to be a good person. The emerging and re-emerging powers are not really pushing for such value system. They are looking at the hardware aspect of Africa. And that's why there's a lot of discussion about infrastructure development and projects within the continent. So from the African perspective, when we're looking at the emerging powers, we view this as powers that are seeking to open up Africa. Why are they doing that? They are looking for new markets. Whereas for the West, they constrain Africa because they enjoy the fragmented markets for ease of control. Now, what is the African strategic response? As the governor pointed out, of course, there's no single country called Africa. There are many, 54 plus. But one can easily analyze what has been going on over the years to look at three main ways Africa responds to all these power games. The first one, and I think Paul has already mentioned, is the transactional approach. Whoever gives you value, you transact and you go home happy. So you play one against the other. The second is strategic pretense by being silent. So you observe, you know the game is going on, but you engage in a game of silences. I think there's a famous Congolese professor, Professor Dipelshin, who published a book way back in the 60s that talked about the African silences. You know, they observe, but they don't talk about it, they just whisper. And then lastly, bid time as the powers collapse on their own weight. I say this, and East Africa has very good examples of how this has been happening way back from the times of Omani Arabs, Portuguese occupation. Of course, when the British came in, there's this lesson that many African countries and people and historians have been observing, that the powers come and go. They're always collapsing on their own weight. So with that narrative, one would say that there's this possibility that in the power competition, we are going to see more heated competition, not even in Africa as we had thought before. It's going to be more in Europe, because that's where the developed markets are, and any power would want to go where the heavy value for money is, and that's Europe. But then for natural resources, unfortunately, which has been the old aspect of how Africa has been engaging with powers that be, looks like Africa is still going to be tied into that small space of the powers that want to, drive their markets. They'll be simply coming here into the continent to fight over the resources. So that's my general view on the topic. And I'm optimistic that with this kind of discussion, probably we can now go for what I'll call the more specific aspects of how Africa addresses the challenges when interacting with the major powers. Thank you.
Excellent. Gilbert, do you want to intervene, or I can turn to Bob, who has joined us?
I think I want to jump in here now, and thank you very much for the invitation. This is the 6th meeting we are having on this very important topic, but this is also one of the most intriguing and more difficult ones. And so I was very happy that the colleagues that spoke before have actually simplified it very much for me, because I just wanted to make a few points centered around one big point, which is that this is a very complex subject, because Africa has never had a strategy towards any of these big powers. And this is what we've been struggling with here at the Africa Center for the Study of the US, whether in fact Africa can have a position on the US. And then of course we come into other discussions such as how can Africa forge a common position on China? And at the end of those discussions, we find out actually that there isn't. And that's what we've been trying to do, is to help in the postulation of positions on each of these individual powers. But the task is more harder when we are asked now to have an African strategy on all these powers. So let me just, I think the answer is very simple to me, that Africa has always had a strategy, I think since independence. And that strategy is called the strategy of non-alignment. What that strategy did, I think at the height of the Cold War, was to allow African countries to capture and seize the opportunities that Paul has been talking about. And it was important that Africa seizes those opportunities because Africa was still very young and very fragile. And therefore, in the context of global power competition, Africa needed that space to develop by staying apart from the two big powers then. The other thing about non-alignment was also that it allowed African countries to work with like-minded southern states to galvanize a global third world voice. And we cannot ignore that voice when we talk about the new international economic order, all the vibrant debates about changing the international global economy in the 70s emanated from African countries tactfully working with the rest of the global, the like-minded southern states. So I believe that is still a very important component of an African strategy. But how did we get distracted from the original idea of non-alignment? And I think there are 2 points we need to put across. The old non-alignment was problematic in the sense that it was largely a non-alignment with the West. For the reason that James has explained, Africa has been engaging with the West for about 500 years, for more than 500 years. So it was natural, it was inevitable that an alignment of the 60s and 70s into the 90s was actually an alignment that was largely Western non-alignment. And it also helped us, therefore, navigate the global order because we are still very products. Africa still saw itself as a product of the West. The second issue with the old non-alignment is at the end of the Cold War, there was some triumphalism that in fact, the issue about African non-alignment with the West had been vindicated because the Soviets had collapsed. And therefore it was easier for Africa simply to continue with the old game of remaining largely within the West, but hanging around the thread of non-alignment. So that became problematic much more recently with the emergence of China and the resurgence of Russia. So our old non-alignment that was clearly Western non-alignment is now under contestation from powers that were there before, particularly Russia, and the emerging ones, particularly China. So the quandary now for countries, especially South Africa, where I'm speaking from, is that they want to hang on to a non-alignment that actually doesn't exist anymore. What South Africa is struggling to do is to become a player that appeals both to the West, but also appeals to Russia and China in a moment when it is actually no longer feasible to play that game. So non-alignment is more complicated than before. And that is the angers that we see in South African foreign policy. It says, no, on Ukraine, we are non-aligned. But on the other hand, there are reports that they are selling arms to Russia. So anyway, that's the point, the quandary now. So how do we get out of that quandary? The way to get out of that quandary is to say, let's literally go back to the old idea of positive neutrality. It helps Africa, and this is my major point. It helps Africa because we have not exhausted the promises and the principles of positive neutrality that the non-alignment movement gave us. We can remain positively neutral, particularly when it comes to bigger issues such as military entanglements with the global powers. We can remain tactically neutral as we seize these opportunities that Paul was talking about. But secondly, I think Africa's positive neutrality allows us African voices in global affairs to become much louder than before. And this is being hinted at Paul's discussion on Africa is being invited by the rest of the world at the global table in a more stronger position than it has ever been before. And therefore, African voices are bound really to deepen as we build our own alliances, not just within the South, but as Africa, Africa as a power that speaks for Africa, but engages with the rest of the world on an even-handed basis. Thirdly, Africa has benefited from global diversities and potential multipolarities. I think Sanusha is saying that it's not clearly multipolar, but I think there are very good elements of multipolarity currently that Africa can draw from. So Africa can offer much to the rest of the world as it has done before. We need our young students to go to Japan to study there, as Paul was saying, just as we need them to go to places like Turkey. I mean, the Turks have always offered scholarship for medical students from Kenya and all these other African countries, which are benefiting us. So there should be no contestation about Africa's linkages with countries as diverse as Turkey, as Israel, as China, and even as Russia. Finally, Africa should avoid, as I mentioned, through its positive neutrality, the military entanglements with major powers. And this is actually my message. If for South Africa, it's true that they have military engagement with Russia, I don't think that falls within what I'm describing as positive neutrality. Finally, I think we should begin to choose our friends much better. I get very nervous when I hear that China is part of the global South. I don't think it is. I don't think it is. So Africa should stay away from that game of pretenses that we want to work with global Southern powers like China. Maybe even Brazil and India should be out of that equation. I think we can begin to identify very clearly how we work with India, how we work with Brazil, rather than pretending that we can work with them as part of a so-called global South. So I think to me, we are to the 60s. Jennifer, this is my message. The 60s of a positive neutrality. And that is Africa's position, strategy for the rest of the world, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bob, do you want to say something at this point, or should we go for a round? And I know we want to open up. So what I might do is ask a first question, but then take a couple more that we can put to the panel. If that's good, and Bob come in at that point, or
Sure.
oh, I mean, as you wish.
No, you
Okay.
can put the questions before people forget.
Okay, yes, we're talking, okay. Well, I do want to take the chair's prerogative to ask a first, and it goes back to a point that the governor made and was kind of echoed by James to a certain extent. I don't want to seem very old-fashioned, but I do think democracy matters. And you know, it's and I guess I would disagree with James to a certain extent that this is something that kind of the West has pushed. I mean, I think African countries fought very hard for their democracies, their liberation. South Africa fought very hard for its democracy. And I do want to get to the question of, you know, the impact of this on democracies and who's choosing the engagement and the form of engagement. I think of a Mali or Burkina Faso, you know, where Russia has come in through Wagner, for example, aligning itself with governments that came to power through a military coup. Not a lot of popular legitimacy, although the coups may have been popular initially. And you know, we can argue the pros and cons of it, but it seems very unlikely that the people of Mali are going to have much say in the form of that engagement when it ends, how it might be modified, for example. I think of Kenya to a certain extent, maybe less degree, but you know, and there've been on the Belt and Road Initiative, you know, is there becoming something of a wedge between kind of the government's engagement with China on infrastructure projects and popular perceptions on employment or environmental due diligence, or does it serve the common person, for example? You can think of South Africa. And you know, while in certain circles the kind of anti-US rhetoric and pro-Russian rhetoric and reminiscing of, you know, the 1980s rings true, you know, damaging relations with the United States will, you know, in terms of manufacturing, in terms of trade relationships. I mean, there are differences oftentimes between government perceptions and interest in great power alignment and citizen engagement. And, you know, I'm not, the US, for example, in DRC Congo, kind of hailing an election that was clearly deeply flawed. So this isn't something, you know, this isn't something the West does better than other countries necessarily. So I want to kind of get at that question of engagement with whom, for whose interests, and the implications of this for governance and democracy to a certain extent. So that would be maybe my question to start out, but I'd love to take a couple from the audience and from the panel to be able to turn back to our speakers. Here.
Good morning. My name is Rachel Jones. I'm the Director of Journalism Initiatives with the National Press Foundation. And I spent a decade in East Africa, based in Nairobi primarily, in Uganda. But I traveled the region doing journalism trainings. I came up with a theory, and I'd love to have at least one or two of you speak to, and that is the issue of gender in national progress and you know, positive change. In that, you know, women are at the forefront of healthcare delivery in many countries. Women do much of the agricultural work in many countries, and yet access to education, basic healthcare, and so many other issues still remains problematic in many countries. So that when we see a country like Rwanda, where the majority of the governing board are women. So I just wanted to have each of you, or whoever wants to speak to this issue of how supporting women would revitalize or even transform economies. Thank you.
gentleman here. We'll take a couple so that we can put them back to the.
Good morning. My name is Annenberg Sharu. I'm a graduate PhD student in African Studies at our university, Department of African Studies. And I'm also a research assistant, graduate assistant for the Center for African Studies at Howard University. So thank you very much for your presentation, sirs. There is something that is always coming back. I think it's about some like the African voice in the global economy. But I just have the feeling that Africa, let me use the word we, are the only continent where we have such like potential that is either neglected or misunderstood by us. But it's always, from outside that we put the light on our potential, natural resources wise, human resources, technology, and comparative advantages. So I think Mrs. Naidu spoke about it, and Mr. Nantulia about the African strategy. Like for me, it's like I'm just asking, what exactly is actually put in place for Africa to have a deep and very like a strong diagnostic of our potential in each African countries. He spoke about the comparative advantages and the diversity. I don't see it as a weakness. I see it as a strength. And I was just wondering, is there a deep analysis of each country's like potential when it comes to natural resources, technology, and so on, so that at some point, Africa can actually work on like lifting up other countries with what they have as comparative advantages, and then engage in the global like economy to have a stronger a stronger position. So that's the question that I have. And someone spoke about the African Union and so on, but I don't know if it's actually happening. So that was kind of my question and my concept.
Great, thank you so much. Well, why don't we start there? Oh, one more question. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Nabiyu Daniel. My question goes to Mr. Kinyanji. Yeah, you mentioned earlier that Africa's partnership is now more based on this global powers, pursuing national interests, important issues related to democracy and good governance. They're a bit declining in forming partnership. That's my concern. Do you think this trend would help Africans to establish a long-term partnership that really practically benefits African citizens? Because currently we see that many conflicts in Africa, the causes are this lack of democracy and good governance. So how do you see this? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's turn back. Bob, I want to give you the first word, and then we'll go back in order.
All right, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks, colleagues, for standing up and for such a robust and vibrant discussion. I think my intervention will be brief. To start off by pointing out or mentioning that what we do have now in international relations and international affairs is that we have a new layer of forms of engagement. In the past, we knew and appreciated the fact that multilateral relations and engagements would be handled at the UN level. You know, we all know you the United Nations General Assembly meetings that happen every September or any other UN agendas. But now we have this new form of engagement under what we might refer to as summitry or summits, you know, where the word summitry comes from. I think colleagues have pointed out the beginnings of this in 1993 with TICAD, which was Japanese established, but even earlier with, you know, Francophonie International. But it wasn't quite prominent as it is now. So much so that now from an African perspective, it is that every single year the African Union, African Regional Economic Communities, and African countries are having to factor in the summits of these global powers. Now, it appears that this summitry as a layer of international engagement hasn't been quite factored in, say, the ministries of foreign affairs in countries at the AU level and the RICS level, because it hasn't quite been formalized as a practice in international relations. In fact, if you look at, as an example of US-Africa Leader Summit, we had the hiatus, the gap of 8 years between 2014 and the hosting of that summit here in Washington, DC in December. So it lacks that formality. And yet, the Ministers of Foreign Affairs and governments more broadly are called upon to kind of invest in such summitry. And therefore, I think that the point that to make here is that African countries will have to really look very carefully at the summits. I think, I know we've mentioned that there are about 8 of them. Some of them are more established, like FOCAC happens every 3 years, TICAP happens every 3 years, AU Africa Summit sometimes happens 3 years, sometimes it extends. Some of them are happening because of the success of FOCAC, as the critique of the US-Africa Leaders Summit has been done, that the Washington DC decided to do a summit because they thought, hey, the Chinese are doing them very well and successfully, and we must join the game. But I think the important point is that because they have potential to divert attention from Africa's own interests, Africa has its own Agenda 2063. Many of these summitry and the engagements thereof are not aligned to Agenda 2063. Africa has its own various architectures in terms of democracy. We have the Human and People's Rights Court. We have the AU African Peace Architecture, which looks at peace and security. But every one of these partners comes with their own promulgations on that and also on matters economic and so forth. So I think African countries will have to consider carefully what their interest is. In fact, in the context of African agents. I think quickly to what colleagues have discussed in terms of what these global powers mean for democracy. I think there are 2 strands of thought here laid out by James Shikwati. One is that these powers come either with democracy promotion ideals, or those that say, no, look, we just focus on development. So we have strands of ideas that are inclined towards democracy promotion, and those that can be said to be developmental, that want to promote the idea of developmental state. I think in the context of Africa, where many democracies are not yet consolidated, where in fact many countries are backsliding in terms of democracy, some of them are stagnating and so forth. In fact, the interesting discussion in current debates is that South Africa, which had become more or less a consolidated democracy, is almost falling back to a form of backsliding. Whether that's true or not is up to discussion. So I think, in my opinion, the best approach is a mix of the two, where we can have democratic developmental states, because Africa needs development, but development should be done at the expense of democracy. I think lastly, one has to consider whether indeed these global powers have the interest of Africa at heart. The narrative here has been that Africa is very important to the world, that we cannot do without Africa. But is that really true? And I think one has to come back to the reality that indeed Africa might be important, but only to a certain extent. And I say this because if you look at policies from Washington, DC, they are more directed towards East Asia, particularly, and Europe to some extent. And that is evident in many respects. Let's take an example. When the war in Ukraine, surfaced, I think there have been many wars on the African continent, and many of them are still going on. But you look at the attention from Washington, DC towards Ukraine, vis-a-vis the attention to the wars, say, in DRC, or in Sudan right now, there's quite a major imbalance. That shows you where the interest lies to some extent. I think you look at concerns around issues to do with Taiwan, for example, and the link to China, and you can see that the Pacific Eastern world is actually perhaps more important. So I think Africans have to be very clear and understand we are very important only to a certain extent. And with that understanding, in fact, that is also true to China, from the Chinese end of things, because the Chinese say Africa is very important. But quite a number of colleagues have done studies to show that in terms of investing in diplomacy, in terms of resources, China values, first of all, the countries in its neighborhood, Myanmar, South Korea, India, and so forth. And secondarily, or even to a very high level, competition with the US. Africa falls behind in terms of being on the pecking order of importance. So I think Africans also have to be realistic on that. I think I'll conclude by saying, way forward, I think our work is cut out for us as people in university, scholars, both faculty and students, think tanks and so forth, because for Africa to rise, we'll have to develop the policies that Professor Kajagala was talking about. And it appears that the AU and regional economic communities and Ministry of Foreign Affairs are greatly incapacitated in that respect. And yet we need to put thoughts that go into policy formulation and policy implementation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. I should say, the first session of this series was held the day after the conclusion of the African Leaders Summit here in Washington. And one of the critiques of that moment was that did Africa, I mean, that's a ridiculous kind of phrase, but did African leaders come here with a message for Washington? And it wasn't clear that there was any clear ask from the collected leadership here in Washington. So going to your point of how do you kind of strategically express and participate in those kinds of summits. So let's go back to some of the questions. Governor, we'll start with you. You brought up the kind of fading of democracy or tilting in favor of interests over democracy. Although some might say that democracy is an interest, but I'll leave it to you.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. And once again, allow me to just mention one or two issues that have been raised by some of the respondents. And I think the first issue is with respect to democracy. And no doubt democracy is in Africa, but it's also good to admit that it has also gotten some African flavor. There are countries that are democratic, but their constitutions have also been modeled in a near dictatorial way. So I think it's also good to agree that democracy maybe is also very specific to a country, to a culture of people, and so on. And quite ironically, some of those places where we have had that kind of African flavor democracy, coincidentally also some of the most stable and that have gained a lot of progress. I don't want to mention Rwanda because it is not right to single out a country, but the point I was trying to say is that maybe it is good to adopt some of these things on a case by case. I also want to look at how, for example, the United States deals with countries in the Gulf region. In the UAE, for example, the first issue is not on democracy. But when we come to Africa, in the past especially, issues of constitution, freedom, liberties, and so on were very key. I recall in the 90s, ambassadors to Nairobi and most of these other capitals in Africa, part of their job was to actually work with the opposition to ensure that certain agenda was actually passed. That has since changed, and we can quite clearly see that. We are not there for saying that it is the right thing, but I think we must look at Africa and the realities today, and probably how we can be able to move forward. The other issue that also came out is with respect to Africa not having one voice. I think this is very important. And this is where African Union would really come in. That before the big meetings in Washington and Japan and Russia, Moscow and all those other places, a meeting is first held to prepare. And I think this is also a challenge to our scholars, to the think tanks in Africa, or that should actually be working in Africa to ensure that the agenda is synchronized, so that as they go there, you're not having like 54 scripts against one from the host country. And therefore it becomes really an agenda of the country that is hosting. And maybe at one time it's also for Africa to exercise its hosting powers. You cannot wait until you're called for the next meeting. And in that case, you go by the agenda of the country that you're going. Then lastly is it possible to have an African strategy? I think it is true that when the big nations, the Western nations, come to a country, one country or the other, it would have been the most logical thing would be to expect that to the African Union or the Economic Council, there would be some sort of technical team that would help these countries, because some of the agreements that have been entered into are quite detrimental. And I must say that there are serious capacities gaps in terms of engagement between some of these African countries, or many of them for that matter, and the big Western power. So there's need to build capacity. And because it is not necessary to have capacity at every country, maybe it's good to look at a repository or a central point where all these can be held. And lastly, on the issue of, I think we talked about the software and the hardware, that the West has been more interested in cultural domination and such. I think it's also good to admit that in recent years, especially the US agenda in Africa, there's also one particular issue that they have also brought on the table that is quite uncomfortable to most of those countries. And like has been said, when it comes to the Eastern countries, China, Japan, and all the others, they're not interested in your culture. But there's a way in which it has been imposed until it now becomes like the biggest thing. And that now becomes a major cause of discomfort. And lastly on that, if you go to Africa today, and I want to start with Kenya, the biggest highways, the biggest hospitals, the biggest airports, you will see them, they are out there. Maybe if you're to do a physical check of also some of the contribution of the other countries, they are less visible. So I think the choice of what projects to undertake has also had some optics challenge. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Excellent points there. Sanusha.
Thank you. I think there's a very interesting discussion that's kind of underlining a lot of the questions and responses that we've seen in this discussion today. The big question for me is the system. Is the system built for equal access to it for everybody? In the way that I think Prof. Gilbert had conceptualized non-alignment, in the context in which we interpret what topology of democracy we think about. And it comes to this kind of very interesting intersection or juxtaposition between democracy about rights, democracy for development. And in the South African context, it was a big debate when we were negotiating the transition of how do you actually utilize or in a way functionalize democracy based on having that intersection between rights, people who didn't have rights, didn't have the right to vote, didn't have the kind of dignity under the apartheid state, but at the same time were excluded from key resources in terms of a proper livelihood, access to very basic amenities, water, sanitation, housing, access to be able to have their developmental rights entrenched in the Constitution. And I think that's the dilemma today within the African context. I think it's a dilemma between what James is talking about in terms of how the system has been operationalized in a particular way of the kind of governance that's linked to rights and duties and linked to the fact that you have a Bill of Rights that entrenches your rights in the Constitution, and the South African Constitution does it very well. But at the same time, there's a serious dilemma in terms of the state delivering on that, in terms of the governance architecture. So we're sitting in this incredible kind of dilemma between what is democracy in the African context, and what does it mean for the number of millennial children, those that are born in the post-Mandela era, those that are born now, who actually are demanding of their governments, by the way, who have to deliver on promises made in the context of where we are. So if I go back to 94 and I look at the promises made by the ruling party in their election campaign, it was 1 million jobs, 1 million homes, and peace. If I fast forward today, people will say to me, Sanusha, that was just a dream in many ways. We're sitting with serious dilemmas of development deficiencies, deficits, whether it's leadership, whether it's governance, whether we didn't maintain the system in terms of delivery. So I think this is a very important point that Bob brings out in the question of, when it comes to the rights, we all have rights in South Africa. I think on that score, we're not sliding. We can actually go and we can utilize it. But where we're backsliding, I think, is on the substantive definition of what democracy means in societies, that they look at the ballot box as not just voting for particular leaders, but they look at it in a much more developmental architecture. And I think this is where the global power, the external powers and the global powers become quite an interesting juxtaposition between themselves. One emphasizes development as the key driver of what everybody needs in society. They want development. On the other hand, you've got the question of what James, the way James characterized it as software and hardware. I thought it was very interesting, and I think that's a key question. And what does this do to people in society who are feeling marginalized at the domestic level? I can talk from the South African context: youth unemployment, people that feel as if the government has failed them. Does that then lead to the levels of what Mary Calder from the LSE speaks about, and that is the new centers or the new levels of conflict is intrastate conflict. And that intrastate conflict is really the bigger challenge because of the spillover effects it has. So I think this is where I think the challenge lies within the African context of how do you actually build that kind of democratic state that covers both the reconciles what are the rights and the access that you're talking about, but delivers on those rights and accesses. I think one point I want to go back to, and Prof. Gilbert put it really well. He talked about the non-alignment of old and how you can bring it back to the positive neutrality. I'm flirting with the idea, Prof, that the system was never built to be non-aligned. The system was actually built to have winners and losers. And I think you mentioned that in the context of where the African continent found itself in 1990 between the victory or the triumphalism of what was seen as an ideological win over a particular model of governance in terms of state and the type of state. And then of course the question, and that also comes back to the question of the type of democracy. It had to follow a kind of rights-based liberal market, the kind of trickle-down effect, which then raises the question that in the system we have today, and the way the model, whether we talk about it in the 500 years or we talk about it after 1945, is that you cannot have a system where you can negotiate a peace, because you have to have somebody that has to pay the price of what they've caused in terms of conflict. So again, the question is, if we want to resolve whether we're talking about the Ukraine-Russian crisis, and I think it is quite eminent and it's quite clear if we go back to 1919 and how the League of Nations and the Woodrow Wilson's 14-point democracy proposal was defined, there has to be somebody that takes responsibility from an ethical, from a moral. And that is why I think in the context of Africa as well is we build that system into our peace and stability, that it has to be that level. And for South Africa, I think there were very, very much that transition that at that point in time made sense. But now there's a sense of understanding who is taking responsibility for all that happened under the apartheid system. And of course, all of the kinds of inherent contradictions that came through the negotiated transition. Linked to the point of the system is not built for fairness, justice, etc., is that the United Nations system is in a crisis. I mean, you're dealing with a system where you've got a Security Council reform, but that's not going to change whether our agency in the G20 is going to give us that level to change what is the model of the veto, etc. So I like the point that we've got agency, and everybody's talking about agency for South Africa, for Africa, or the AU to join, like in the model of the EU, to join the G20. And India is quite active and very much an advocate of this, because it sees this as an opportunity to revitalize its relationship with Africa as well, because we haven't had an India-Africa summit, I think, for more than 5 years now, and they're still debating this in India right now. And the question, I think, linked to this entire debate is who drives the relationship from the other side. In the case of China, we know that there's a whole community from the state level. In the case of India, it seems to be very little state-led and more private sector-led in terms of the India-Africa engagement. And of course, led by the Confederation of Indian Industries, as well as by FICCI. And I think to a large extent, the challenge is really whether Africa's agency belongs only in the G20, or will we actually see that reform or transformation of the United Nations Security Council. And there's a debate about whether or not it's going to happen. The final point to make is really the question of, if the system is not built in the way that includes inclusiveness, military entanglements become part of the space. It's very difficult to actually think about where does the military industrial complex lie. This does not mean that we have to condone what South Africa is doing, but the military industrial complex is built to a system, and that system is built for instability to create peace, but built to the actors who are basically going to define what that peace looks like and who gets the spoils at the end of the day.
Great, thank you, Sanisha. Excellent. James, or Paul, let's go to you, and we'll try to come back for another round. So if you can keep answers fairly short. Okay,
thank you, Madam Chair. This is certainly a very fascinating discussion. Really, what Prof has said about non-alignment is very, very intriguing, and this is something I would definitely like to look into myself, and perhaps even to follow up further with Prof. And bearing in mind that there's a non-aligned summit that's taking place in Uganda in December, it would be very interesting to see what kind of non-alignment emerges out of that discussion, and indeed whether Putin and others will be in attendance. I think South Africa is likely to set the pace for Africa on that. But look, Jennifer, democracy is a huge part of this. Let's go back to the Africa Barometer survey that I was referring to. You see, my argument is that the question of democracy, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, has been resolved. Africans demand democracy. And when we talk about democracy, I mean, we're not talking about, African, Australian democracy or British democracy or American democracy. Africans are demanding to live in a democratic society. I mean, this is as old as the OAU. If you look at the African Union Charter, it's just the conventions, the institutions that have come out of it. I mean, it is really fascinating to read those statistics. That 85% of polled Africans across 34 African countries reject one-party rule. 85%. 75% reject military rule. And 70% demand to live in a democratic society. Now let's look at how that breaks down demographically. Okay. So the cohorts from the ages of 15 to 25, then 25 to 30, and then 30 to 35. This is where the highest demand is. The demand is highest in that cohort. And then it begins to drop when you get to 45 and up. And that kind of gels, that is tied to the macro demographic situation on the continent, where upwards of 70% of the population is under the age of 30, even below. So we can see that the center of gravity for that demand is young people. And I always go back to a conversation I had with a colleague from Peking University in China, who said, Africa is basically a continent of adolescents. This is a continent of teenagers, restless, demanding, vocal, and very, very clear in terms of the kind of society they want to live in. So I would argue that any policy that places democracy and democratic governance at its core is a winning policy. It's a winning policy because that is a policy that aligns with the majority view on the continent and aligns with the demographic realities of Africa. And any policy that does not do that risks, one, their reputational costs to it. And from a long-term perspective, these are policies that are not going to find support on the African continent. They may find support among elites and so on, but they're not going to find support among the majority of Africans. One only has to look at this very interesting debate where the French president, Macron, sat through a unscripted a panel with young Africans talking openly and frankly. And I actually found it, I felt sorry for the man. He received an earful, but that's what Africa represents. So it's extremely important that the issue of democracy. And Jennifer, you mentioned the DRC. Africans were very upset about that, extremely upset. And in fact, that was a low point for US policy. It was a low point for US policy. And I think it was an opportunity lost. And I think that was a warning to Africa's external partners about the importance of democracy and democratic governance as part, in terms of African aspirations. That's what I would say about that. And I think on this issue, security assistance also has to be very careful, because the problem with security assistance is that it can have an effect of inadvertently or perhaps even advertently strengthening regime security. And we have seen around the continent that every time you have protest and upsurge demonstrations for greater democracy, especially during elections, it's the security forces that are called up to suppress this. So security assistance then becomes extremely important in terms of how it's leveraged. And given that China has now become an important security partner, United States, United Kingdom, I mean, one just has to look at the countries that have bases in Djibouti. It becomes extremely important. One cannot conduct security assistance in a vacuum. And I think this applies to everybody, United States, China, Russia, and everybody else. That's what I would say on the question of democracy. On the question of supporting women, yes, the United States in the past has actually been very good at this. It kind of fell away. Jennifer, you might have more insight on that. But things like supporting women mediators, supporting women peacemakers in different processes. I think Mandela was very good at this, bringing women interlocutors into the Burundi peace process. And a number of mediators then took that on board. But it's kind of losing, there's lost momentum. The momentum is kind of, is not as strong as it was before. And I think there's a very, very strong case that can be made. Given the conflicts that we're seeing around the continent. I mean, if we look at Sudan, the people that essentially the movements that were demanding that the soldiers must go back to the barracks and give democracy a chance. Essentially, these were women. So it's extremely, again, it's something that cannot be ignored. The final thing that I would say is in terms of Africa's strategy, I think it's going to be a bottom-up process. It has to be bottom-up. And Sanusha belongs to an organization that has been trying to do this, I think since 2018, so since the 2018 FOCAC, has been trying to galvanize a civic continental movement towards identifying what a potential Africa strategy towards China could look like. And I think that's laudable. It's laudable. And it's having an impact even in the halls of the African Union. People are talking, officials are talking about that. We look at the Africa Center for the Study of the United States. I mean, this again this is an illustration of that agency that is now emerging on the African continent, where you have an institution that is looking at the United States, from an African perspective, right? So I think again, it's going to be bottom up. It's going to have to be a bottom up pressure, and the governments will then have to react to that pressure. I think that's what I would say. But again, I'll go back to the non-alignment. I'm very intrigued by that. I have a feeling that Russia and China are framed by many of these African actors as the China of Mao Zedong, the China of Zhou Enlai, which of course is not the China of today. The Russia of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, and all the support that was given to African and Third World liberation movements, that is not the Russia of today. In fact, Vladimir Putin had very harsh words for the Bolsheviks and for Vladimir Lenin. In fact, our friends in the South African Communist Party must have shivered when they read that. But I think it just goes to show that perhaps there's a misalignment in terms of how many of our African colleagues are looking at these two countries in particular. These are countries that are completely different from what they were during the Cold War, and perhaps I'm just thinking aloudly. I'm just thinking aloud about the issue of non-alignment. But I think I'll stop there.
Excellent point on that last one. Very interesting. So James and then Gilbert.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to have some 3 to 4 points to bring on the table. The first one, agreeing with Bob Wekesa's observation. I think what's key for Africa, first of all, is to identify the position it is in globally. When we look at global trade, for example, I mean, if we do a rough estimate of a global trade worth $300 trillion US, and you get that Africa participates only at 3%, a continent of over 1.4 billion participating in such a trade system at only 3%, that becomes a source of where we need to put our agency. Because if we put our agency on how do we transform our participation in global trade to ensure that we meet the demands of the adolescents Paul is talking about, the youthful population that we've already talked about, and the issues, skills, you get that the priority then leans more towards what is it that we are doing wrong that has made us to be constrained, yet we have the ability in natural resources, we have the ability when it comes to youthfulness. The other week I was in the Chancellor Scholz meeting here in Nairobi, and he was talking about Germans looking for young people to work. Actually, he was saying they need close to 250,000 per year. And our president was telling him, we can even give you 300,000 if you want right now. And that's Kenya alone. So it means when you spread it across Africa, and you see that what you refer to as the North already has a demand which Africa can actually supply. And yet we are just at 3% in terms of how we interact with the rest of the world. I think that gives us the agency. And then Sanusha had talked about supply chains and value chains. That to me gives us the second one. How do we bring them down to Africa? Who is this that is making it difficult for efficient supply chains to operate within the continent so as to address the needs of our youthful population, and then also make sure that we participate effectively as far as the global trade is concerned. And then to Professor's point, when we are rich in natural resources, I think ignoring military and security would be a fatal mistake. And that, I think we can see it here in East Africa. There's an attempt now by East African community countries to try and stabilize one of our richest new members, Democratic Republic of Congo. We are making initial mistakes, but I think out of these mistakes, there are some learnings that probably Africa can build on to ensure that we build what I'll refer to as loosely as an African security architecture. What I would agree with Prof is that to avoid this being owned by an external player. So how can we now, if I go to Madam's Chair's point, maybe make it democratic so that we say ours is an open architecture, but we want to set the standards. Remember, when we don't set the standards, whoever sets the standards then takes over what happened. So I think Africa really and urgently requires some kind of continental security architecture, but we need to work on the kind of standards that can make multiple players to be able to operate within that environment. Lastly, let us not downplay the power of memory, because I think a lot of our conversations seem to assume that we just start with the slate of today. But I think memory runs deeper across centuries. And now what's happening in Europe, the war between Ukraine and Russia. For Africans who can remember through the books, of course, that we read, it was the Second World War that triggered a lot of the motivation towards liberation movements, because at least those who participated in that could see that Africans could fight those who were dominating them. The question on the table is, what kind of lessons are Africans drawing out of this ongoing conflict, and what does it mean for how they view the powers that be? Because I think there's a lot going on, and I don't think if the war ends even tomorrow, Africa will be viewing United States the same way they did 10 years ago. I think there's a lot of shifts in terms of how Africa is viewing, let me say, the West, generally speaking, and the East, generally speaking. So I would end at that. Thank you.
We're getting close to time. I did want to turn to Philip van Niekerk, who's in the office, who's a longtime journalist, South African journalist, who's written two interesting pieces recently. One on this whole Russia kerfluffle, if we can call it that, in South Africa, and one on Kenya and its strategy, which I thought was a very nice contrast of the two. So Philip, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you very much. It's been a great conversation and very illuminating. And just to take on a few points, I think Paul's tweet about China is not the China of Mao and Zhou Enlai, and Russia is not the Russia of the Soviet Union is really important. America is not the America of 1990. It's really important that in understanding this great power, you know, what Sanusha refers to, this interregnum, where this new world is kind of being born, this new world order, and it's happening. And if Africans are going to take advantage of it, they really have to understand it a lot better, not see it through the old lenses, not see it through the Cold War or the scramble for Africa or whatever. This is a new era, And it's an area that has enormous potential for Africa. Again, to come back to the point, in 2050, 40% of the population, young people in the world will be in Africa. The future markets, the future consumers, the future people who are going to be driving change are going to come from Africa. Africa is culturally stepping onto the world stage. Everything from Afrobeats to movies, fashion, design. Africa is not in the shadows. Africa is an extremely important kind of leader in terms of where the world is going. So it's really important that we, for instance, look at what the G7 was doing this weekend. One of the things that comes out of it is they're going to build a railway line to the Beto in Angola, to move minerals from DRC and Zambia, to the coast, and at the same time providing capital to build processing plants so that you're not just exporting raw materials. There are opportunities in so many ways in which there's sort of great power conflict. And I won't go on for too long, but I think if we characterize the great power conflict, I think Olaf Scholz was speaking this weekend, he talked about de-risking rather than decoupling. And there's been a kind of thinking, oh, we're going to have two worlds. We're going to have, the BRICS maybe and US plus the West, which is really US plus versus China plus. But in actual fact, what we're going to see is, yes, there are two kind of systems evolving, and Sanusha makes a point about friendshoring with the West. But in actual fact, the connections are too deep, already, US is China's major trading partner. That's not going to change. The world is integrated in a way that it's not going to go back. But we need to understand, what does it actually mean right now? Say, for instance, the US has thrown out the Washington Consensus. How do we understand where Washington is going? And how do we understand it, not because it's some academic theory, but it's something that we need to understand for our own sake as Africans, to say, well, how do we take advantage of this? Because this is really potentially our moment. We've come out of COVID with a lot of debt, we haven't been able to spend our way out of it like the rich countries. So Africa's economically in a weak position right now. That will change. And let's see how we go forward. But we have to really understand, what is this moment? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Philip.
Yeah.
Should we, Adam, did you want to say a few words? Yes.
Maybe we need to rethink what is a great power. Maybe Africa is a great power. It is not a supplicant to others. If 40% of the people in the world are on the African continent, Africa is a great power. What's Russia? Russia is a small country with well-armed mercenaries, basically, and some money. What's China? China has 20% youth unemployment right now. They're facing political instability. What is China? Think back in the mid-1950s, when there was the Conference of Non-Aligned Nations, convened in Indonesia with Nehru, Zhou Enlai, not the United States. The United States opposed it. What if there was a Conference of Non-Aligned Nations focused and based in Africa? And suddenly, what we think of, many people think of as great powers today, the US, Russia, China, are invited as your partners, an African agenda, saying this is what we would like from you, this is what we would like you to do. Russia is not in Africa for Africa. Russia is in Africa for Russia. China is not in Africa for Africa. China is in Africa for China. So the people who are going to have the enlightened self-interest to be for Africa are in Africa. And I think that Africa is a nascent and soon, very soon, great power.
Excellent. Bob, a few words to.
All right. Thanks, Jennifer. I think my concluding remarks are very pragmatic, or practical inclined, arising out of governance comments and a few other comments, in fact, in terms of we have really discussed this topic of African global powers in Africa, or Africa's response to global powers. You can tweak the topic whichever way you like, but it's a reality of our time. And in addition, I think that there's lots of research that has been produced out there. In fact, I think we are not counting the theses and dissertations, masters and PhD universities that never see the light of day, perhaps. But in terms of journal articles, think pieces, and so forth, there's a lot out there. We have very many talks and talk shows and so forth that have also produced very interesting perspectives. On this discussion today, we have seen some excellent ideas and perspectives and angles to the topic. I think what remains to be done now is to consolidate those into practical steps that we can undertake. So as partners for this Africa Future series, that's University of Southern California, Howard University, GW, George Washington University, where we are today, University of the Witwatersrand, where Gilbert is and where I am also from, as well as the speakers here, Paul, James, you all, and Sanusha, you all represent very interesting perspectives that can brought on the table. I think what we need to do now is think very seriously on how to build the capacity of our individual countries, of regional economic communities, and the African Union to develop policies, or at least strategies, or at least positions. To the governor's point earlier, the African leaders shouldn't go to this summit next time without knowing what they are going there for, without knowing what their agenda is, and without knowing what they should come out with. So I think this is just a follow-up and an appeal to all of us to watch out for the next practical steps that we shall be working on. And for those on the call who are interested, I think we'll welcome you in terms of developing these capacities, towards Africa engaging better with all the global powers collectively, but also individual global powers. Thank you, Jennifer.
Great. Listen to all of our speakers and to folks in the audience. Thank you so much. Really rich discussion. I really do hope we follow up on what Bob has just said, because I just think there's a whole lot more we could be delving into here. Hopefully we can stay in touch with the panelists here and all of you and folks online. I would love to carry forward this discussion, and we'll follow on with Bob's thoughts going forward.